Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder, Executive Director of the Maryland-Delaware DC Press Association, and I am delighted to welcome our panelists and you all to our session today to discuss our Sunshine Week project, which dealt with the transparency of school systems around the state, in the district, and in Delaware. So today we have Miranda Spivack, who's moderating our discussion. She was the lead author and researcher for our project. She has a deep resume, having reported for decades at the Washington Post for local coverage, and now working as an independent investigative reporter, publishing stories in places like Reveal and MDDC and throughout our region on issues dealing with government accountability and transparency, as well as immigration and education. So delighted to have her here. I'm going to turn the program over to her and allow her to invite her panelists up. So welcome, Miranda.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, everybody. First of all, we are recording this, so just be aware. And we took a look at 29 public school systems in the Maryland, Delaware, DC area, mostly with the idea that we wanted to find out what information was easily available to people who are not journalists, not lawyers, not experts at open government, but have a need for basic information about the school systems. We have three great panelists to help us talk about all of this, and I will introduce them momentarily. I just want to give you a few more details about what we found. I think you will not be surprised to learn that school systems are not the most transparent arm of government. Some people think they are the least transparent arm of government, and in most jurisdictions in our region, but also around the country, the public spending on public schools can be half of a local jurisdiction's budget. It's a huge amount of money and not a lot of public access to what's going on in the schools, depending on what you're looking for. We looked for very basic things. You can read our story on the MDDC website, and also it's being published across the region in member news organizations. But we really found that, yes, you could figure out how to listen into a school board meeting, and that's good. During COVID, that really became much more accessible because everybody was using Zoom or some other platform. But then if you really wanted to get, maybe get the agenda with details ahead of time or get the minutes after the fact, that turns out to be much harder. Searching for basic information, like if you put in school superintendent contract into the search engine, you may or may not get it, even though they are all generally somewhere out there in the public domain. So, and we also obviously want to hear from people who are in our audience about what you're looking for and what you can't find and what you think school systems ought to be able to make more accessible. So on our panel today, we have Andy Schotz, who is the editor of the Frederick News-Post and a longtime veteran of the region, and worked as an editor and a reporter at various newspapers in Maryland and in New York. And Sabrina LeBoeuf, who is writing about education for the Baltimore Sun, where she's been for a year. Before that, she worked in Louisiana. She's a fairly recent graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, which has a great journalism school. And then Al Carr, who is a longtime Maryland legislator. He also was a council member in Kensington, where he lives with his wife and 3 children. But he was in the Maryland General Assembly for 15 years, worked on a lot of open government issues, also issues involving energy, transportation, housing, and healthcare. And Al is a big proponent of expanding access to government information that, of course, you, the taxpayers, have already paid for. So starting with Andy and Sabrina, why don't you, Andy, why don't you talk first a little bit about the kinds of things that you have looked at as both a reporter and an editor, your staff has looked at, and where you think, and also Andy edited our story, so he can talk a lot about what was in that too. And Sabrina then can talk about the experiences she's had in Baltimore and in the region, which I know she's encountered a lot of challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about the project because it kind of dovetails with the types of things that we'll do in our newsroom a lot, which is looking for basic information. What we set out to do is start with some of the most elementary things. Who are the school board members? How do you contact them? By email, by phone? If you want to send a message to the superintendent, if you want to know when the next school board meeting is, what is the agenda? Those are things that we're constantly looking at. Obviously on your beat, you know who your school board member is once you start, but certain things that you will go to a website to start with. Maryland has a Public Information Act that requires records to be turned over upon request, but it shouldn't be needed. You should start with the idea that if something is public, you can quickly access it.
Sabrina, you want to talk a little bit about your experiences in Baltimore?
For sure. So kind of jumping off of what Andy's mentioning, that it'd be so much nicer if you could just look it up online. That hasn't really been my experience within Baltimore, whether it's dealing with city schools, helping out my beat partner, Lillian Breed, or working with county schools, which is mainly where I focus. There's a lot of issues where either they don't want to turn over records requests. There's a lot of back and forth if I am going to get something in the end. And, there's also issues of, data sets also not being available. There's that component of it as well. And then, if they do have the data sets, they don't want to give it to you for free as another barrier. So they can ask you for thousands of dollars as like another way to kind of like keep you from getting this information that you're trying to access that should be public because it's of the public domain, be it, data sets or emails or things like that.
Is it your sense that they have the information in a usable form and they just don't want to share it, or are they not compiling the information in a way that is either usable and easily understandable to the public and perhaps to their own staffs?
It's definitely a little bit of both, because in terms of, enrollment data, they have these like dashboards where you can see what they say is up-to-date data about enrollment and things like that, to look at, issues such as overcrowding. It's using outdated data, and then when you ask for recent stuff, they're kind of like jotting it down on a piece of paper and giving it to you that way, versus like having a usable spreadsheet where you can kind of go through and be able to search through things or be able to compare different data. So there's definitely a little bit of both, where either the data is not easily usable or available, or they have it and they just don't want to share it.
Andy, what kind of issues are you and your reporters encountering in terms of stuff that's not easy to get?
Well, I think that part of the test of what we did is not necessarily that it's inaccessible or that somebody doesn't want to turn it over. It's just that the fact that you have to put in a request and wait is part of the problem. I mean, it's the justice delayed is justice denied type of thing. Not quite the same, but if you're on deadline and you need information quickly, and it's information that should be easy to get, if somebody says, I'll get back to you in the morning, they've kind of destroyed your ability to get it. This is not related to the project, but we just encountered something with another state agency yesterday that we've been trying for weeks to get a roundup of testing of water. And the latest response we get is, oh, well, that will require a PIA request. Well, what's the difference? Why does it matter if we put the words under the Maryland Public Information Act request hit reply all and send it again. What is that doing that we weren't doing? And so things like that are frustrating. There should be a default that things are public, records are public, information is there unless it shouldn't be. And sometimes the default is the opposite, that unless you say the magic words, the vault doesn't open.
So, and do either of you encounter, are they doing any kind of, I hate this term, but proactive posting of information so that once somebody has made a Public Information Act request, they just post it somewhere on their website and say, here's a list of things people have asked for? Or is that, which would actually make it easier for them too, conceivably? Are you seeing any of that?
You think?
I guess
no.
Yeah.
Well, Montgomery County, we talked about this the other day. Montgomery County has I don't know how well and faithful they are to it, but there's a data portal that, as a reporter and editor, I found very interesting. You can look through other people's public records requests, and that's a little secret that maybe nobody knows, but if you put in a PI request and ask for other people's PI requests, you get them. That request is considered public. So why not make it so that when somebody asks for it and you release the information, it's a one-time thing and then everybody has it. We don't need to go through this repeatedly. So Montgomery County actually posts the information it shares with, this is not the school system, but the county. They share what they released, and now they don't have to do that again. That makes a lot of sense.
Al, what is, tell us a little bit about your experience in the General Assembly, which itself is not a paragon of transparency, but also in terms of your efforts to kind of push on these issues and where the hangups are.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda, and good morning, everybody. So I was in the General Assembly for 15 years, and I think over that time there was some progress, not that there doesn't need to be further progress, but definitely a time of culture change in the General Assembly. And before that, I was in municipal government. So I've been on different sides of open government. I've been the recipient of MPIA requests and Open Meetings Act complaints, and I've also dished it out, sent such requests, and been able to shape some of the policies. So, a couple of my early efforts legislatively, I was able to negotiate a bill for the Montgomery County school system where I live, where they would have to disclose all their spending on a website, on a database. That was a time when this was a really popular idea at the federal level, at the state level. So we were able to get that passed. And I also did a bill on eFOIA that says if a public record is in an electronic format, like a spreadsheet or something, you have to share it in that format as opposed to like a scanned PDF where you can't see what's inside it. So there's still some loopholes. In Maryland, we've had a very, very strong open meetings law. I think probably one of the strongest in the US, but that hasn't been as true for the Maryland Public Information Act. So some of the gaps I think that are still there are in minutes. Minutes are supposed to be posted online, but they're not always posted online. And then some organizations take advantage of this loophole where you don't have to have minutes at all. You can just, if you stream the video, you can just say, oh, watch the video, that's our minutes. And
the video that will last for 3 hours. So
right, 3-hour video where you're supposed to try to navigate and find that one piece that you're interested in. And the General Assembly has been going in sort of agency by agency at the state level and requiring different agencies to stream their meetings and do minutes, as well as post their agendas in advance. So that would be really nice to see more of that at the local level. Another issue is email retention. I know at one point Montgomery County Public Schools had this policy where they magically, all the emails would vanish after 30 days, and that seemed to be sort of designed to thwart the MPIA. So, and the MPIA doesn't address retention. So, that's an issue. There are some spending that you can't find because it's not done by the school system, but it's lobbying. When you have outside organizations, $1 billion school system budget, and outside organizations are trying to influence that. We have these very weak lobbying disclosure policies, so it's impossible to know how much money is being spent to influence. There's also financial disclosure statements. Those can be hard to obtain. You have to drive somewhere physically to request them. And of course, then they take down your name and your address, and that gets sent to the person who filed the disclosure statement. We fix that for the General Assembly. So for people like me who are former members of the General Assembly, you can go online and obtain my financial disclosures from the past. But that doesn't exist for
and do you get notified?
Government.
Do you get notified?
And I will get notified of that.
Yeah.
And then there are things like redaction. So for certain types of records, they're supposed to provide it if the part of the record that they can provide, as opposed to if there's a part of the record that they're not allowed to provide, they're supposed to redact it. But then there's some loopholes where if there's one little piece that they can't disclose, they deny the entire thing. So that's probably something that needs to be fixed. And of course, I did recently do an MPIA request to my school system, and they did threaten a large fee to gather the information. They did ultimately back off on that. And then they, it says you can take up to 30 days. Doesn't mean you have to take 30 days. You can take 2 days, or you can take 10 days, but they seem to treat that 30 days as, they have to take exactly 30 days, which is a little bit of a problem. And of course, the denials, where you still have these denials in part or in full. And, thanks to efforts of a lot of folks, some of whom are on this call, Delegate Brooke Learman, our comptroller, was successful in passing some reforms to the MPIA that did make it a lot better, required proactive disclosure of a lot of information, and provides a MPIA compliance board remedy, so you don't have to go to court. So definitely some progress, but we still have a little ways to go.
So is it your sense that when they throw out these big fees, which I think all of us think is often a deterrent, a purposeful deterrent, but here I'll take the side of the government for a second, although that everybody knows for me that's probably a little uncharacteristic, but they can argue, and I think with some reason, that they don't really have the funds they don't fund open government records requests. It's not a priority for them, and in fact, if they were found to be spending a lot of money on that, people would complain, that it should go to teacher salaries or some academic program or whatever. I mean, is that an issue that local governments need to think about somehow designating funding for this, or is there a solution to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a record keeping issue. You should be, if you're a local government, you should be keeping your records in an orderly manner so that you're able to find them quickly and make a copy of them. I mean, it's understandable if it's something that's 15 years old that it might take some digging to get, but if it's something that's recent, that might be a records keeping issue. And I think it does sort of depend on, it's not supposed to matter, who you are, what your name is, what your position is, and why you're asking. But I think people do get sometimes treated differently. I know I've been treated differently, as a legislator, and then as a lame duck legislator, and now as just a citizen. But I think that local governments view these MPIA requests as often as hostile, and they don't want to share the information, and they do use. They will, err on the side of requesting a large fee when they don't want to share the information for whatever reason.
Are they at risk? I know that many states, actually, if you disclose information wrongly, that even the government employee can be sued, that they're not immune from being sued for that. Is that a reasonable fear in Maryland or Delaware or DC? I don't know.
I mean, that could be an excuse. I suspect that is something that is part of the law that is very rarely exercised. I think a more likely scenario is they don't want to be bothered. They don't want to share the information, or sometimes they're not trained or educated on the law. I think the risk of them being, getting in trouble or fined or prosecuted for oversharing, I think that risk is very low.
Andy and Sabrina, what do you think in terms of records retention? Are you bumping into that where they say, school systems are saying, we don't have that, we don't have to keep that? Is that an issue, or?
I personally haven't run into it, and I have asked for some pretty old records. So luckily, I haven't had to face that.
No, I haven't run into that either. I mean, I understand Al's point about retention of messages. I think would be most likely to be deleted over time, because you think, well, we don't need that anymore. But that's not really the way to think about it. It is a historical record. And, we don't flush our presidential records down the toilet on our way out. Everything gets preserved. And, there's something, if it was something that helps understand a decision that was made, it should be there for somebody to see.
So what kind of information should be easily findable for people who aren't journalists, aren't lawyers, aren't members of the General Assembly? What do you think people ought to be able to get and not necessarily getting on these websites? Andy, do you want to take that one?
Well, we tried to pick a range of things in what we pursued. We had 14 items, and as I said, the most basic thing, if you open up the website, what do you need to know? And you know absolutely nothing. Where is the school board office? Where will they meet? And so we started with those, but we also took on some ideas that were not necessarily just nuts and bolts, but I want to know how much teachers are paid in my school system. We thought about that from the context of people paying taxes, or perhaps people are moving to an area and they want to do some comparison shopping before they move there or send their kids there. So teacher salaries, budget information in a way that was easily understandable, discernible. If there's an executive summary, we look for the idea of per pupil spending, which, we kind of had some debate as we went along. Well, that's not necessarily something they would post, but why not? And that's the thinking, is how can you get away from the old thinking of what can we get away with and be considered open and we're doing our job, versus switch it around. How can we put absolutely everything online? Sure, there's a big cost to that, but when you're talking about catching up, you're then going to have to spend a lot of time, and you can't necessarily dump all of your records online. But how about from here on, create a policy where everything you do is posted and accessible, so you're not fielding these questions. I mean, big part of the expense of records requests is now we have to go dig through things. Well, why? Why do you have to dig through things? Why are they not in a place that, everything should be electronic by this point. In 2023, it should be electronic. So then we don't have to worry about digging through file cabinets.
Sabrina, you had mentioned before we went on the air about a challenge that you're specifically having in your coverage. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what you were looking for? I'm just wondering if it also sort of fits into the categories that Andy's talking about, that it ought to just be there.
Sure. So what we had talked about before was, I'm doing kind of a follow for a book banning story that I had run a couple weeks ago, and I had gotten a tip on certain things to request in terms of email correspondence between different board members to see which ones are, in that push for book banning and what books they're looking at banning next, or at least investigating. And I've run into this issue of being told, that's not okay for me to have, either because the nature of the email is confidential, or because they found so many emails that they want me to pay about $7,000. In terms of what Andy was saying of making all of this available, I do kind of understand, not making every single email available online, but at the same time, I think, there should be better records keeping, also in what the vein of what Al was saying too, that, to be able to go through these emails easily it could be somebody's job to, be able to find them and be able to share them, versus saying like, oh, we're just gonna like Google search, and see, oh, like what you're asking for, there's like 10,000 emails related to that within this like 1 week time frame. It's like, I feel like they're just trying to like pull as many emails as possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So in terms of, do you ever get any help where they'll say, look, you can narrow this request to this and we can fulfill it, and that might satisfy what you're looking for, or is that not feasible?
They don't really present those options. It's more of me trying to say, look, I understand you're saying that's a lot. Let's try and narrow this down. And they will keep tacking that on as extra hours that they need to keep looking to narrow down the search. So it's just making it more difficult to get the records that I'm asking for. And then on top of that, they're not granting waivers because they're saying that journalism for the paper record is not a reasonable excuse to have public information.
God. So what would be, if journalists aren't working in the public interest, who is?
I don't know. I wrote a very long letter just explaining every single point in my request, being like, this is why it pertains to public interest. And they're like, that's not enough. You gotta give us a better reason.
Yeah. So Al, you had mentioned that going from being a member of the General Assembly to a member of the public has opened or shown you that people are treated differently in these requests. Do you have some tips for members of the public about what they can do? I mean, short of obviously pursuing a more legalistic approach, but is there any way to be more persuasive?
Yeah, so I think the beauty of these sunshine laws is really a lot of times you don't, it's outside of the courts. You don't need to be a lawyer or hire a lawyer. So they're really powerful laws. So on the Anthony Brown is our Attorney General. On the website for the Maryland Attorney General, there is a great guide. It's the Maryland Public Information Act manual. So it has some great overview of the law, and it has some example requests. And I think, as Sabrina mentioned, it can be helpful to narrow the scope of your request. If you can make that as narrow as possible to really what you want, then you're going to minimize the risk of how long they're going to take to have to search for it, and then coming back and asking for fees. And it's important to put in your request up front that you're if there are any fees, that you're requesting a waiver. You could explain why. I don't have a commercial interest in this or a personal stake in it. I'm want to publish this information or obtain it to help advocate for better policies. So that's important to say those words. And yeah, that the narrower you can make your request, the better make it as clear as possible, just so that there's no misunderstandings, because sometimes you'll get into like a back and forth with the agency you're trying to get the information from. But if you want to, to try to get the information as quickly as possible, the clearer you can make your request, the better.
And is it your sense that like Andy said, they're saying put it in writing now? You can't just sort of call up and say, where do I find this? Assuming people answer the phone these days.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you have to sort of say the words. This is a Maryland Public Information Act request. Just kind of leave no doubt that you're invoking your rights to get this information, this public record that was produced with your money as a citizen. And maybe over time, as folks get more educated, that won't be necessary. But I think for the time being, you have to sort of do that and say that, unfortunately. And then on the OAG Office of Attorney General website, there is a list of Maryland Public Information Act contacts for each agency. Each custodian is required to keep that updated in that centralized place. So sometimes that's a question: who do I even send an MPIA request to? So that's and sometimes those emails are out of date, but at least that's a starting place. Or some agencies will demand that you fill out a web form, for which you get no record of your request, but the law doesn't require that. You could simply send it to them through the email to get the request in. So
one thing we noticed, at least among the Maryland school systems, was that they were using a software program called Board Docs, which I interviewed some people at Board Docs after discovering this. Is that system helping, do you think, make these school systems more transparent, or is it just sort of another way to say, oh, we're doing this, but it hasn't really changed anything? I don't know, Sabrina, if you've bumped into that at all.
I would say that Board Docs is something that my school system that I cover, they use pretty well, actually. They do a good job of, publishing the agenda, at least a week in advance, with all the documents attached or presentations attached. So that's really helpful. And all of that is kept in a backlog up to 2013 online. It would be nicer if it was like a little bit more of a backlog, just because there are some issues that are just so longstanding within Baltimore County Public Schools. But I would say they do a fairly good job of, keeping records public on there and making them easy access.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I ran into when I was talking to the people who run the program is that the school systems can really pick from a menu. So, for example, most of them seem to post some version of their agenda, but it's not annotated. So that if they're using a document, the school board's going to use a document that is prepared in advance. It's not posted, so it's still hard for the public to follow along. Or they are part of the live streaming, but then, as we mentioned earlier, you have to listen to 3 or 4 hours to find the item that you're looking for. So are there simple best practices, do you think, that school systems could adopt here that would make either using that system or another system? I mean, can you think of like 2 or 3 things that you would just be aching for them to do that would make it easier for you?
I would
and for the public.
Yeah, definitely. I would say in addition to the videos that they post, they post those immediately, but the minutes do take a little bit to come up. And I would say if they could post those as immediate as the video, that would be so much more helpful. That's really the main thing, because if you're wanting to double check, the vote for some item the previous night, you'll have to kind of search for that. But once the meeting minutes are up, it's pretty easy to go through the video, I would say. And then I would say also, in addition to that, if, like, they could update the agenda kind of live, because with every meeting they will vote on the agenda and make additions or make subtractions to the agenda. If they could kind of update that as well, that would be helpful. Just kind of keeping it as current as possible. That would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, how about Andy? What do you think?
Yeah, so the board docs site phenomenon was pretty interesting. You could easily be skeptical. We're going to bring in an outside firm or consultant, and they're going to help us. And where is their motivation? It's going to be to meet the needs of whoever's paying them. But I think the board docs phenomenon actually does help with transparency, because it creates a baseline that may not be there. And we ran into some websites. Usually there are very small entities, may not have any resources, but I don't think that's an excuse to be unhelpful and opaque. So the board docs sites, there was some variation, but for the most part, if you wanted to look for a packet, for example, you want to follow along with what's happening. And when they talk about this vendor, that everyone up at the dais understands, and they don't speak, openly about it, because they all need to have the information in front of them that they need. There's the public's chance to get it. And I think that many of the sites, many of the school systems that are using board docs have a pretty good baseline because of board docs. Minutes was different. There does not seem to be much interest in trying to keep minutes posted there. I think we ran into some, but not a lot. If you're looking for something that will be helpful, as Al said, they often treat the video itself as the minutes. Well, indexing matters a whole lot. If you're going to do that, then make it easy for me to search. Do not just dump data or video and say it's up to you, because that's not transparency.
I don't know if anybody has any sort of concluding thoughts on our panel that they want to add, or before that, if we have any questions in the audience. I'm not sure we did, but Rebecca or Sam, is there anything there that you want to add?
Actually, Andy's point about sort of proactive disclosure versus that passive disclosure, I think sometimes custodians hide behind the idea of like, well, it's all online. And I would love if you all could speak to, just as kind of general practitioners, I think especially for members of the public, you don't know what you don't know. And the idea that everything is available and someone just has to dig in and find it. I understand that board docs is a really interesting tool to kind of create some standardization amongst school systems presenting information. But how do you kind of know what you should be even looking for, and how much of a responsibility do you all think school systems have to educate their constituency about what they're doing in a proactive way? I guess that was a couple questions in there, but I'm curious because you deal with these things all the time.
Well, we put out the question, what do people want to know? We asked that to anyone who's reading the series, the package that we produce, which is available on the MDDC Press website. There's a main story, there's a best practices sidebar, there's a list of the questions and topics we pursued, and there's a little bit of information about the board docs. But we said, what is it you're looking for? We don't want to assume that we're the only ones that are the practitioners of information and that this should all be geared for us. We may have different needs, but I think that was a lens we tried to look through. Miranda, as you wrote the story, you included the idea somebody wants to do research. And so how do they find out about their school system? I mean, don't just rely on your realtor or doing a Google search. You want to look for things that are accessible. So I don't know if everybody has the same interest, and maybe a lot of people don't need everything. There's going to be a range of what you're looking for. There's parent advocacy groups that will be looking for every last dime spent in every contract. And then there's somebody else that just wants to know, like, what was that vote on the curriculum? Where do I find that?
say kind of jumping on that point that Rebecca mentioned about, being proactive, just for saving people's time, I know that all different government agencies do end up serving parents, but school systems do serve parents the most, I believe. And parents are dealing with tiny humans all the time, and they don't really have a lot of time on their hands to be digging through all of this stuff. And so the more that school systems can make things easier to find, and less of that, like, here's a giant pile of stuff you can dig through, like that would just be better for them too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I found is that we looked in different ways when we were trying to find this information. So the first thing I did, and Andy did, and Sam did, who were doing the research, was to put what we thought were reasonable keywords into the search engine for the website. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, often that turned up nothing. And then when you went to Google, you might be, superintendent contract was one of those where you could Google that, because probably every news organization that is covering a school system has at some point written about that. So it would become available that way, or it would give you a link back to the website. But if you put it in the website, it wasn't showing up. Or vendor contracts, or outside contracts, or contracts. Sometimes that would show the agreement with the teachers' unions, or very rarely did it show the construction cost of the renovation of the local elementary school. I mean, which I think people do want to know. They do want to know what the school system's spending priorities are, and also who's getting a piece of the action. What company is that? The brother-in-law of so-and-so, whatever. I mean, there are sort of a million different reasons to want that information, it seems to me. And search engines were generally terrible in this project.
Yeah, Miranda, you hit on a good point, particularly, I would say, in the category of teacher salaries. You would think if somebody wants to know what the teacher salaries are, they will type in the search term, teacher salaries. Not true. That is not how you find it in almost every school website. You have to know the phrase negotiated agreements. And if it doesn't show up in the search term, and you're going to just search the website, you're going to start with teachers, maybe? Nope, don't do that. Go to human resources. I mean, that's the idea. It's built for the people within the system, not for people outside.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
So as we kind of look ahead, I know we're winding down, but I wanted to open it up to any of our audience members if they had questions. I have another one, but I don't want to be greedy with my questions. Is there anyone that has a question that they'd like to ask? And Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask my question next, but we have Lisa Kirshner, the ombudsman, here in our audience. And so I always like to ask her to give a little plug for what she does, because she mediates disputes between requesters and custodians. So she's always a great person to go to if one is having some trouble. So Lisa, you can prepare yourself for a second, and I'll get back to you in a moment. But I was really interested, Sabrina, about your ongoing discussion about banned books, because I think that, honestly, as a parent and as someone, as a reader and as a civically minded person, I am really interested in how knowledge is flowing and what is off limits in terms of curriculum or access to books. And I am really kind of surprised when you said that information wasn't readily and publicly available about what either the category of decision making is or what's going on. What were some of the why wouldn't they give you that information? That seems so basic.
Yeah, so they gave me a couple different reasons. One, they said that my request wasn't in the public interest for some reason, which doesn't make any sense to me. Then they said that the volume of emails, including the word book, was too many. And I was like, I'm requesting emails with the phrase book ban in it. And they're like, that's a lot of emails. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to narrow this down for you. And there was a lot of back and forth on that end as well. And then I was also told to request, a letter that the superintendent had sent out to the board members for the month of January. He sends out a letter every month to them, and they're like, that's internal communication. You can't have that. And I was like, what? And then, with the fee waiver, I can't afford to pay that much money. My company doesn't want to pay that much money. So we're going through this back and forth process that's been taking, longer than it should have. So that's why they told me that.
So to me, in a nutshell, that just seems like obfuscation and barrier, sort of like flimsy not quite flimsy barriers, but barriers that are specifically being thrown up to shield that information that, it's not in the public interest, or your request is so broad and it'll cost you a lot of money, all of which just seems kind of specious. So I hope that you keep fighting the good fight on that, because it is, we had considered at one point at the Press Association doing a project around banned books, simply because all those discussions start at the very local level. There's no and suddenly it's, it's this federal piece. It is literally at that local school board level. So they're definitely critical discussions. Lisa, would you like to make a little plug for the PIA Ombuds program? And if she has stepped away, which she must have stepped away, sorry to out you like that, Lisa. I will put in the chat the link to the PIA Ombuds program. And so I would recommend that if anyone is listening and having a problem with getting requested information, or even kind of understanding where the next step might be, because what we also find, just like with Google searching versus searching on a website, there are different avenues to find information. And, when one door is closed, there might be another opportunity. The Ombuds program is a really good resource. So I wanted to thank all of you for joining us here today. This was a really insightful and important discussion. And I appreciate your work on this. So thank you very much. Miranda, did you want to close us out and mention anything else?
Yeah, well, I just want to thank our panelists and all the Sabrina and Andy in particular, who really helped a lot with this project, and Al, who's been around for a long time, being a longtime advocate for open government, which still I think is a rarity among some of his General Assembly colleagues, but too bad he's not there anymore. And, we are definitely interested in feedback on the project and ideas that about things people are looking for, either in the education domain or elsewhere, for future projects. So, thanks to everybody who tuned in, and, happy Sunshine Week.
Jack, did you want to?
I wanted to ask one question, particularly of Delegate Carr. And my experience when I worked on the newspaper all the time, a long time ago, was that elected officials tended to be more responsive to, because they didn't want stories that made them look bad in the newspaper. Do you think it's worthwhile for local editors and sometimes publishers to meet with the head of the school board instead of the superintendent if they want to get something done with a philosophy of responding to these questions with an answer other than no, which is the default answer for, I think, every school system in Maryland and probably the country, is to answer no on every question?
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Jack. And it certainly wouldn't hurt to meet the head of the school board. There's such an interesting culture at school systems in Maryland where, there's the school board that is, at least in Montgomery County, they probably work almost full time. They're paid a small amount. They don't have any staff. And then there is sort of the school system, the superintendent and all the employees of the central school system, and their interests seem to be different. And I think the school board members are sort of discouraged from participating in some of the things that are the purview of the staff, and the staff sort of has sometimes a not invented here syndrome, where they don't they like to be sort of immune from outside ideas and outside influence and outside suggestions. But yeah, it certainly couldn't hurt to approach the actual head of the elected school board.
Great, thank you for that.
Do you mind if I just make another plug for MDDC? And
Oh, of course.
We did this project now because it is Sunshine Week, and we always pick something that illustrates how does open government work, and how do public records work, and do they work well. We did a similar project to this in 2017, where we looked at all 156 municipalities across Maryland. We used a checklist of 14 items, and it's debatable about who did better, the school systems or the municipalities. I'm going to say the school systems might have edged out the municipalities. There were only 2 jurisdictions in all of Maryland that hit all 14 items on our checklist.
That is in the municipal one.
The municipal one,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It was Garrett County and Laurel in Prince George's. So I would encourage you to look at their sites. It's now 6 years ago, but I think they'll still be in the pretty same ballpark. They were both shining examples of how to present things without being asked for them.
Lots to learn, lots of upward trends to capture and look for. So thank you all again for your time and your expertise. I hope we can continue this conversation in sometime in the future. In the meantime, I have posted links to the Press Association package. You'll also see it in member publications throughout the week, because it is Sunshine Week, and we hope you will continue to focus on government transparency and openness this week and every week. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Go on.